different than is used in the US but not in the UK, and different to is used in the UK but not in the US. I'm Teacher Mike, and today we are talking all about the words differ, different, and difference. First, we're going to look at how to pronounce them. Then we're going to look at the different ways that we use them in everyday conversations. And finally, we're going to look at some common expressions that use these words. For example, what it means when someone says, "I beg to differ." So, first things first, pronunciation. All three of these words are usually pronounced as just two syllables. Differ, different, difference. You do not need to say different or difference. It's not wrong to say them as three syllables. However, most people do not. Now, how to use them? Different is an adjective, which tells us that two things are not the same. Sometimes we just say that things are different. For example, apples and bananas are different. When you do this, you can also follow the word different with a noun. For example, apples and bananas are different fruits. Or, Thailand and the United States are very different countries. And you can say that one thing is different from another thing. For example, walking is different from running. You might also hear different than and different to. These mean the same thing as different from, but they are informal. Also, different than is used in the US but not in the UK, and different to is used in the UK but not in the US. So it's usually best to just use different from. It's standard, more formal, and used in both countries. And sometimes we only have one of the things that we are comparing in the sentence. For example, if someone has already said something about walking, instead of saying running is different from walking, you can just say running is different. If you want to be specific about how they are different, you can say they are different in that. For example, dogs and cats are different in that dogs are more social and cats are more independent. Difference is a noun, and it means something that is different. And when we talk about differences, we often include the word between. For example, there are many differences between pizza and ice cream. When we want to explain what is different between two things, we often use difference in. For example, there's a difference in price between the two products. That means that the thing that is different is the price. But when we want to be more specific about how they are different, we often use the difference is that. For example, one difference is that this one is more expensive. Then we have differ, which is a verb. For example, my wife and I differ in many ways. That means that there are many ways that we are different. And just like different, this one we often use with from. For example, my opinions may differ from your opinions. That means that you and I may have different opinions. It's just a different way of saying it. You can also specify how much two things differ by using the adverbs slightly and greatly. For example, the new software differs slightly from the old software. Or the cost of living differs greatly in different parts of the country. When making questions with these words, we usually ask, "What's the difference between them?" or "How are they different?" For example, what's the difference between an interest and a hobby? Or, how is a resume different from a CV? Or if you need to make it really clear that you want to know about multiple differences, you can ask, what are the differences? For example, what are the differences between this hotel and that hotel? You can also ask, how do they differ? For example, how does British English differ from American English? However, this one really isn't very common in everyday conversation. Usually we would just ask, how are they different, or what's the difference? Also, if you're not sure if there are any differences, you can ask either, is there a difference between them, or are they different? And before we go to the final part with common expressions that use these words, I first want to give you just a few more sentences that I think you will find useful. First, I don't understand what the difference is. Or you could say, I don't see any difference between them. Next, there's not much of a difference. This means that there is a difference, but it's very small. You could also say, there's hardly any difference, or they're basically the same. When you're shopping, you can ask, does this come in different colors? Does this come in different sizes, or does this come in different materials? And instead of asking, does this come in, you can also ask, do you have this in? However, does this come in is asking whether or not the manufacturer makes that, whereas do you have this in is asking whether or not they have it at that specific store. And finally, here are a few common expressions that use these words. First is to pay the difference. This means that part of something has already been paid for, but now someone needs to pay the remaining part which has not yet been paid. For example, if you bought a shirt that costs $25 and you want to exchange it for a shirt that costs $30, they might tell you that you can exchange it, but you'll have to pay the difference, which would be $5. Or you might hear someone say that something is a whole different ballgame. This means that something is completely different from something else. For example, I have lots of experience teaching adults, but teaching children is a whole different ballgame. That basically means that teaching children is very different from teaching adults. And finally, we have I beg to differ, which is basically just a polite way of saying I disagree.